thanks to Karen for giving us all that great information on the state-funded pre-kindergarten workforce. But I'm really going to be talking about the broader early care and education workforce, so hopefully that will help with some of that framing and context for folks with those questions. But before we jump in, just wanted to say hello again. I'm Dr. Caitlin McLean, Senior Research Specialist at the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment at UC Berkeley. And our research center is based within a labor and employment research institute, but our center is entirely focused on early care and education. And so, you heard in the video earlier today about some of the work that we've done, especially around our SQL survey tool, which really documents that link between, early educators' work environments and well-being and quality learning for children. But today, what I'm going to do is talk to you about another area of work that we do, which is our Early Childhood Workforce Index. And that's our biennial, not annual, 50-state report that we do that looks at the status, the working conditions of the entire early care and education workforce, and then also looks at various policies to prepare this workforce, to support them on the job, and to make sure that they're compensated. So before I talk more about that, I do want to be very clear about who we're talking about when we say the early childhood workforce, when we say early educators. So we're talking about all of those folks who are paid to educate and care for children from infancy through preschool age, so that 0 to 5 age range, which would include the teachers that Karen was talking about earlier, but also, kind of the wider workforce. So directors, teachers, assistant teachers across settings, including, those programs that we tend to think of more as early learning. So Head Start, those state-funded preschool programs, but also childcare programs that are in centers and in homes. In part because, sometimes we think about these things as separate, but as Karen mentioned, they're often in the same building. You can have a classroom where, the teacher is being funded by state pre-K dollars. You can have a classroom right next door in that same building where they're getting Head Start funding. They may be using some Head Start funding and some childcare funding. It's tricky because the system has, a lot going on. But even though our early care and education system is divided in this way with different programs and funding streams, we know that early educators themselves, regardless of where they work, are engaged in nurturing young children and helping them learn in that really crucial early stage of their development. So it's important that we think about this entire workforce and not just those folks in state-funded pre-K. So who are these women, largely? Almost entirely women doing this work, around 97–98%. About 40% of these early educators are women of color. As you heard in the video, many early educators actually do have bachelor's degrees. A little over a third of all early educators in kind of center-based programs actually have a bachelor's degree or higher. And if you're just looking at lead teachers, not including assistants, a little under half, about 43%, actually have a bachelor's or higher. So even though the standards are hugely variable across states and can often be extremely minimal, basically nothing, often to work in a childcare setting, that doesn't mean that early educators don't have these qualifications. Often they do. But that being said, because our system remains divided with, greater priority and more spending on those services that are perceived primarily as early learning. So, those public pre-K services that Karen mentioned, or Head Start. There are really stark disparities in the preparation and the working conditions of early educators depending on where they work. And the divide is clear between kind of anybody working in the 0 to 5 range and K through 8, as you heard with Karen's presentation. But even within that kind of early education space, there are these divides. So generally speaking, if you're an early educator who's working in a school providing publicly funded pre-K, you're more likely, or you're most likely at least, to be earning pay, more in line with elementary school teachers. You're more likely to get similar professional benefits and supports, even though, as Karen said, there's often still a gap, compared with educators in other programs. And so, you saw that disparity for pre-K teachers in community-based programs who often get lower pay, few or no benefits. And then it's even worse for folks who are providing early care and education, but are not being funded by that state, those state pre-K dollars. So folks working with infants and toddlers, or even 3 to 5 year olds, but in childcare settings. So this particular slide is pulled from one of our infographics, and it's really showing that even when you're just looking at early educators who hold a bachelor's degree, there are very meaningful differences in pay depending on where you work. Again, it's higher if you work in a school. It's higher if you work with 3 and 5 year olds rather than infants and toddlers. And this is really important to understand because so much of this revolves around how we fund early care and education. There has been much more sustained public funding for those services that are for 3 and 4 year olds compared with younger kids. Even though, as Jenny said, we know how important those early years are. And it's also important to understand that currently those teachers working in those state-funded pre-K programs actually make up a pretty small proportion of the overall early educator workforce. So when you're thinking about how they're already at a disadvantage to K-12, they're actually kind of in the best jobs in early care and education, and those jobs are a small portion of overall where you could work if you're looking to go into early care and education. So just to make this a little more concrete, if you're looking at early educators who are classified in federal data sources as childcare workers, they actually hold one of the worst paid jobs in America. We have ranked every occupation in the United States by average pay. And every time that we've done this, we've found that only 2% of all of the occupations in the US earn less than childcare workers, who earn $11.65 an hour on average nationally. For preschool teachers, and to be clear, this data source is not just talking about those in publicly funded pre-kindergarten, but really anybody working with 3 to 5 year olds. Even here, again, the pay situation is not much better. You can still see there's a large gap in pay on average with kindergarten teachers. So as you heard in the video this morning, this is a very difficult job to survive on and to support your family with. But we know that these women are preparing young children to be successful in school and later life. And for the past year, they've actually been risking their lives and the lives of their families to continue to provide this service. They were worried about their own health, the health of their families, but providers really tried to keep their doors open, in part to ensure their own financial security as small business people. But with higher costs, fewer children enrolled, this has led to job losses and program closures. And we know that the childcare industry is still only about 84% as large as it was before the pandemic began. And at least 164,000 employees have lost their jobs. So this is really a crisis. There was a staffing shortage before the pandemic started. The pandemic has just made things even worse for folks. I know that we are a little low on time. Jorge, I was gonna do our pop quiz. Is that still fine?
I think we may be a bit behind on time. Maybe perhaps at the end of the presentation we could try it out, but I'm not sure.
Okay. All right, well, I'll just keep going and then we'll see if we can come back. So I can kind of wrap up from here because I would love to do the poll, the pop quiz, but I just wanted to highlight that these are really just the top level findings from our report, the 2020 Early Childhood Workforce Index. There's plenty more where that came from. You can use the QR code, and I can also drop the link into the chat to explore our report in more detail. These were really our national findings that I was talking through, but we have data for all 50 states and DC. And we have information on wages that I talked about, but also a variety of workforce policies and initiatives. So we look at qualification requirements for educators. We look at scholarships that are available for different levels of education. We look at, are folks doing anything to try to raise compensation? And we also provide specific policy recommendations on how to improve early childhood jobs. So, again, you can find all of this online. You can use our State Explorer to get the national picture for different areas. And then you can also click through and see all the information for your own state.